I think we should reconsider the Kantian critique. What was Kant critiquing? In a sense, it was rationalism in general, making metaphysical claims based off varieties of argument and intuition that weren't really ultimately well-grounded. That's what Kant's critique seek to demonstrate, that all of our thinking about metaphysics is filtered through the forms of our own perception and cognition. Those forms are simply given, they're opaque, and so we can't think of reality as it is in itself. We can only think of reality as it is given in representation. And there seems to be some element of truth in this. However, it presupposes epistemological foundationalism. It might be accurate in a way in terms of a phenomenological description, but the implication that our representation of the world is limited in this sense, the implication that entails that we can't make reliable metaphysical claims is not valid. Again, it presupposes foundationalism. Foundationalism is basically the idea that proposition A depends on perception A. Proposition B depends on perception B. Claims, it can basically be summarized as in logical positivism, as a meaningful claim must either be a description of empirical observation or a tautology. But modern epistemological thought has moved beyond foundationalism. The problem with foundationalism is outlined by Willard Quine, and it's summarized in the Duhem-Quine thesis, which is that a single observation, a single proposition, always depends on a bundle of auxiliary hypotheses and theories. Like, the world doesn't come pre-packaged in a conceptual way. We can't ground a single claim about the world in a single isolated perception. The way that we perceive in the first place was already influenced by our theory. Like, if you really grasp this and see that this is the way that we think about the world, it's not like this simple perception grounds this simple claim about reality, but the way that we in language even formulate any single claim is going to contain ontological baggage. That's not just a relic of language, that's a relic of the way that we naively interpret objects of perception. It's always in terms of our unifying worldview and model. But that worldview and model isn't infallible. And if we engage in metaphysical speculation to update our ontology, then when we come back and look at objects of perception, our interpretive framework, our worldview will have changed, and the way we think about justificationary claims regarding individual perceptions will be different. It's not a simple matter of, I see this, I claim this, see, I see it. It's more than that. Every claim is ultimately embedded in a holistic worldview. And Leibniz was conscious of that. He knew that his system had to be grasped as a whole. And he was very concerned with how people thought of his system and his thought. And so he went to great lengths to present exoteric representations of the system that don't go into as much detail. And then he had an esoteric doctrine, which was the same in terms of the content. Like, it described the same ontology and cosmology and everything, but just presented somewhat differently. Presented in long chains of, symbolic logic. That's why he developed his universal calculus in an attempt to resolve these sorts of disputes and establish like a firm foundation for claims. So in this way, he goes beyond just epistemological holism. In the context of that holism, there can be a theory about ultimate foundations of knowledge. And this is where it gets confusing for people. Like, there is a truth to epistemological holism, but within any given worldview, they can believe that their knowledge ultimately is grounded upon some fundamental thing. Like in Chris Langan's system, it's this idea that the syntax of reality of any finite structure ultimately has to be tied into a universal kind of pre-syntactic, he calls it unbounded telesis, but there's a kind of principle of potential order, potential meaning, and all syntactic structures are kind of like operating on a similar kind of communicative principle. The language of reality is translatable always into itself. And I'm not going to give all of his arguments for that, but that's an example where this is in the context of his view. That is the theory of the ultimate foundations of reason. So he has an explanation for reason, but I wouldn't defend it by just saying, well, this variety of foundationalist rationalist claim is like necessarily true, because that would violate this kind of Duhem Quine thesis idea. So the move is to put forward the whole worldview on the basis of its total coherence, explanatory power, fitness, predictability, all these different categories, but not to refrain from building that basic rationalist foundation. And I think Leibniz and Plato were both conscious of this. Like the ancients were conscious of these problems. They were conscious of these epistemological problems. People always underestimate the Greeks. And I think it's led to a shallowness of thought and a bunch of modern prejudices that people just can't think around because they don't know how to think around them. They're crutches, like foundationalism, like empiricism. But yeah, Leibniz was very modern in his approach. By the standards of contemporary philosophy, I don't think Leibniz's presentation it falls to Kant's critique. So that's where we went wrong. And I think also Kant was not in the best position to evaluate Leibniz's ideas because many, many papers were unpublished during his lifetime. I mean, if you look at it in a kind of cursory way, Leibniz's system looks a lot like perennialism. Like he basically argues for the existence of karma and something very similar to reincarnation, although he's careful to say it's not technically reincarnation, but he would say that when an animal dies, its monad becomes very, very small and then eventually grows again from the conception of some animal, and that it can grow into a new animal next time. And so like a giraffe can die and then be reincarnated as a horse or whatever, but it's not reincarnation. It just becomes very small and then moves on. It's a little silly, but you know, his thought certainly went beyond the bounds of Christian orthodoxy at his time, and he was careful not to be censored. And so there's explicit discussion of his esoteric, exoteric divide in his own thinking in terms of the mode of presentation. But perhaps he also reserved certain true doctrines. I mean, there's like 50,000 pages of his writings out there, and only about half have been translated or made widely available. So I think like we might still gain something from going back to Leibniz and studying what he had to say. And he was like, that's what was Kant critiquing? The Leibnizian system. And that system was dominant in Germany for 100 years. The Leibnizian Wolffian system. What would have happened if that philosophy had continued to be investigated? He believed there was a role for teleology in nature. He wasn't an atomist. He understood the importance of the role of the mind. His system answers many of the modern problems of philosophy that are really just products of materialist presuppositions. He's certainly an important figure and someone I'd like to look deeper into. I've read quite a few of his essays and things, but it is a whole system. And yeah, I don't think we can get anywhere in solving modern issues unless we stop exclusively reading modern texts. Maybe going back and finding some of those things that the tradition has overlooked. Maybe that would be beneficial. Leibniz, Wolff. So if you want to talk about Leibniz's system with me, I'll leave my Skype in the description. And if you want to support this channel and help me eventually start a philosophy school like I want to, then I'll leave the Patreon and PayPal links in the description. Thank you guys for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments.